Hi, this is Eric, and it is April 1st, 2025. I guess we could call this April Fool's Day, but I kind of wonder, given the what's been going on in Ukraine and probably across the world, seems like every day is a Fool's Day, and we're gradually discovering that there's a lot of foolishness going on in the world, and it's not always so pretty. But in any case, what I want to talk about today is what I call the Ukraine scam. The Ukraine misadventure has finally hit the bricks, so to speak. It literally hit the bricks, and that may be a pun in a certain sense. But in any case, what I'm going to talk about is the fact that um, the United States, used Ukraine to destroy Russia. That is the story, actually, and it's taken, I guess you could say, from the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. This has been a long-term project, and here we are in 2025. The misadventure really, hit the road running in 2014 with the Maidan coup that was initiated by the United States. In fact, Joe Biden was instrumental in that. He gave the final quote unquote attaboy to Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Eastern European Affairs. So I'm calling this, this is this expression FAFO, which is like FA is in blankety blank around FU blah blah K um, around. So FA blankety blank around, and FO is find out. So we're in this we're in this stage here now of it's where from an Elizabeth Kubler-Ross point of view of the stages of denial, anger, acceptance, that sort of thing. So what we have here is, I'm calling this the Ukraine scam. Is finally seen for what it is, and what is going to be the result of it. So the United States had this idea after World War II that they wanted to weaponize these neo-Nazis, these Nazi collaborators actually, who were, these are Ukrainians who exhibited the same kind of racist, um, superior sense of Ukrainian racial superiority that the Germans had, and so they collaborated with the Nazis. But the Nazis, they said, well, we appreciate the fact that you are racist like us, but we're actually, more superior than you. So as a result, Stefan Bandera realized that he was kind of caught between the Germans, the German Nazis, and the Soviets, who really didn't like him at all because he was a terrorist and killing tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of Poles, Jews, Russians, communists, and other Ukrainians who didn't agree with his ideology. Well, World War II ends, and the precursor to the CIA, and then finally the CIA, once it was created in 1948, decided, oh, okay, well, let's their own internal documents say, well, Banderas he's a terrorist, but he's our terrorist, and we're trying to get rid of the Soviet Union, and eventually we're trying to get rid of Russia, so we're gonna, take care of this guy. Well, it took the Soviet Union several years after World War II to finally root out these terrorist cells that were in Ukraine. They were jailed, either killed or jailed. Stefan Bandera escaped to, I guess it was West Germany, but he was eventually assassinated by a KGB agent because he was, he was a, bad person, and if you're a war criminal and you're responsible, that was their attitude towards him. So flash forward to 1991, and the Soviet Union ends, and the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic was actually one of the most prosperous republics in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was made up of the Russian, Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and all these were all constituent republics of the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And Ukraine was decimated during World War II, but under the starting actually with the end of World War I, and there was a civil war within Ukraine. Some people wanted it to be separate, these nationalists. But eventually there was a civil war, and Ukraine was brought into the Soviet Union. And Lenin basically said, we recognize, Ukrainian as a nationality. There's a kind of a language that is not. The Soviet Union created systematized the Ukrainian language, and they honored the fact that there is a kind of a Ukrainian nationality. It is a variant, you could say, or a sister ethnic group within the Russian space. So it was given a state of its own, you could say, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And during the course of between 1920 and 1940, it was given, it was built up significantly to be a major industrial area of the Soviet Union. When World War II broke out and the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union through Ukraine, the Bandera people allied themselves with the Nazis, but most Ukrainians actually sided with the Soviet Union. And as a result, one of the major armies, there were a number of different Soviet armies. There was the Belarusian front, there's the Ukrainian front, and there were others. And the Ukrainian front was one of the major factors in winning the so-called Great Patriotic War. Now, after World War II, again, the Soviet Union built up Ukraine, and it had a heavy industry. It had a great aircraft industry, shipbuilding industry. It had a wonderful film studio. You can find them on YouTube. They're very, very interesting films from the Odessa film studio. It had great farming because it has excellent soil. And because of this, the West, and especially Germany and the West, have always thirsted after the Ukraine as a place to get the resources from. But the thing is, I think it was in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter, he was a rabid Polish descendant of nobility and a rabid Russophobe. His whole career was basically trying to bring down Russia. And there's a tremendous strain of Russophobia within Polish society, unfortunately. In any case, he wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard. And in that book, he said that we really want to bring down Russia, but the way to do that, what he was saying, it was called The Grand Chessboard in relating it to global primacy. So the United States has always had it in its DNA that it has to be the hegemonic power. Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about it. Paul Wolfowitz, the Wolfowitz doctrine, basically said the same thing. So there's this drive within the U.S. Ruling classes that they have to have hegemony. And Zbigniew Brzezinski said that the way to break up Russia is to go after Ukraine, which had gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. So there we are, 1997. And then in 2004, the U.S. staged a color revolution in Ukraine. Basically, they engineered an overturn of an election, which was apparently legitimate, but they overturned it, put in this guy named Yushchenko. I think his name is Yushchenko, I think his name was. And one of the first things he did was to validate Stefan Bandera and said he was a hero, even though, from a Soviet point of view, he was a war criminal. And in fact, he was. I mean, how do you define somebody who goes around killing tens of thousands of people, slaughtering them, committing massive atrocities, which apparently even the German military, didn't like. So now Ukraine is slowly being dragged out of the Russian cultural space and into the West. But in 2010, there was a new election, and a guy named Yanukovych was elected president. And at that point, the United States planned a new coup, basically. And in 2014, Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Eastern European Affairs, she gave a talk, actually, in which she said, "We have invested important word, invested $5 billion to promote democracy in Ukraine and other projects." Well, let's translate that. Democracy means overthrowing the Yanukovych government, and other projects means inserting comprador elites, empowering them, and bringing in people from the United States. These were asset strippers to steal the collective wealth, the common wealth of the Ukrainian people. That is what actually happened, especially starting in 2014. Now, they employed these neo-Nazis, and there were several of these Nazi groupings. The Azov Battalion is the most notorious. The Idar, the Tornado, the Misanthropic Battalion. So you had these extremist groups who were basically empowered because the United States had overthrown the legitimate government, and these Nazi elements are grossly nationalistic, extremely Russophobic, and they were attacking people who were Russian speakers, partly because they're Russian and partly because they were resisting this coup. So in Odessa, in May 2nd, 2014, a bunch of these thugs came down to the Russian city because it's culturally Russian. It was created by Catherine the Great Russian empress. They went down to Odessa and slaughtered 40 plus, probably as many as 100 people when they peacefully demonstrated against this coup. So this was the trajectory that Ukraine was on. And finally, in 2022, after 8 years of bombing and attacking these people in eastern Ukraine, which were primarily, these are, like 90% Russian-speaking territories, finally, at a certain point, there was plenty of evidence to the Russian intelligence that the Ukrainian military, which had been it had been beaten in 2014 by the resistance, and at that point, I'm probably repeating things that many of you know, Germany and France, and especially Germany, Angela Merkel prevailed upon Vladimir Putin to have peace talks to give the areas of Ukraine some degree of autonomy, so that they would be allowed to speak their own language, keep their own culture, and not be persecuted by these neo-Nazis, located in who had taken over in Kiev, with the active assistance of the United States, and also probably MI6 as well from England. Okay, so there we are in 2022, and finally, with evidence that there's biological warfare laboratories in eastern Ukraine that are targeting Russian DNA. There's a massive military buildup, which the West had specifically, built up to be as strong as a NATO army. The plan was to overrun the eastern areas of Ukraine, and basically conduct either both a slaughter and an ethnic cleansing of those areas. Russia basically stepped in and preempted that. let's back up a little bit, because in Yugoslavia and in Libya, the United States had employed a doctrine called the responsibility to protect. And basically what that said was that if there's a threat to a local population by an evil government, then the world had a right to step in and prevent that. Well, in the case of Libya, that accusation was cooked up by the West, and they destroyed Libya. And it was cooked up in Yugoslavia. They destroyed Yugoslavia. So the responsibility to protect doctrine that the West invoked to destroy those countries was based on false premises. But in Ukraine, the responsibility to protect doctrine would apply, because the West had empowered these people in the capital of Kiev to overrun and kill thousands of people. They had already killed at least 14,000 people in eastern Ukraine. So at that point, in February of 2022, Russia finally invaded under that doctrine, and they didn't go in. It wasn't like the equivalent of like a shock and awe, which is what happened in Iraq, where the U.S. or Yugoslavia, where they bombed Yugoslavia to shreds in I think it was in the late 90s. The Russians did not bomb indiscriminately. They specifically avoided bombing civilian infrastructure because they considered Ukrainian people to be Russian in the Russian space. They're basically, they're cousins, and I'm saying literally cousins, because I have friends who are Russian and they have Ukrainian family. There was a lot of intermarriage, so it's like literally bombing your own cousin. They wouldn't do that. But the West, is always demonizing Russia and accusing it of all kinds of atrocities, which they themselves are actually guilty of. So that brings us to 2025. And the whole Ukraine project has gone completely sour. The United States thought that they could drag Russia, entice Russia into invading Ukraine, then accuse it of atrocities and violating international law, which the United States does all the time. They decided to institute sanctions against Russia, which they had been doing for years before, in fact. And they thought they would be able to bring Russia down economically with sanctions, and they thought that by arming Ukraine to the teeth, and also by giving it military and intelligence backup, that they would be able to defeat Russia and eventually use Ukraine as a battering ram, as a dagger in Russia's throat, to bring down Russia and get control of Russia's resources, because that's what it's really all about. In 1943, there was a movie it was a documentary created by the United States called The Battle for Russia. You can look it up on YouTube, The Battle for Russia, and they talk about the history of how Russia has been invaded many times throughout the centuries, by the Germans in the 12th century, the Swedes, the Poles, the Finns, mostly the Swedes, I would say, and the Poles, but also France in Napoleon in 1812, and then after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Soviet Union was invaded by, I don't know, I think it was I forget the number, but it was like at least 8 countries: United States, England, France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Japan, and they thought that the Soviet Union was weakened because it's gone through this terrible World War I, which had weakened Russia as a state, bringing down the Tsar. And also there was a civil war going on because the monarchists, the people who opposed the Russian Revolution, basically appealed to the West and said, hey, help us out here and get us back into power, and we'll we'll take over Russia again, and we'll share the spoils with you. Basically, that's what was going on in 1917. Well, the Soviet people, the new Soviet people, united, and they kicked all those people out. So that was England and the United States invading the Soviet Union in 1917. And then, of course, in 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and they caused, there was a total of like 27 million Soviet people. These were Ukrainians, Belarusians, um, millions of regular Russian people from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. 27 million people were killed by the Nazis and their many European allies during World War II. And it's significant the fact that many of those Nazi allies are in the EU now and are in NATO at this point. So what we're talking about here is that there's been a continuous war against first the Soviet Union and then Russia for basically 100 years. And the purpose of it, as this movie points out, is that Russia has massive resources. And here's the issue is that the West has historically, for 500 years, plundered country after country to get hold of its resources and enrich itself at the expense of the African people, the South Americans. The Incas were slaughtered, the Aztecs were slaughtered, the Mayans were slaughtered. In Africa, the many African peoples, they were basically enslaved. Their countries were ruined by the invasions of the French and the British and the Germans and the Belgians, all basically committed genocide in Africa. So that's how they've gained their wealth. But the problem is that since World War II, and especially with the help of the Soviet Union, there was a drift away from colonialism, and so this parasitic relationship that the West has had with the rest of the planet has been losing momentum. And the Soviet Union was certainly a part of that process, where they were helping out these countries, especially in Africa, and also in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela. So there's many countries that have tried to extricate themselves from the yoke of the Western imperialists, and that is one of the main reasons why Russia has been on the hit list of the West for decades. Partly it's for several reasons. Partly it's because the West simply cannot stand Russia standing in the way of Western hegemony. That's a major factor. The second factor is that Russia has massive amounts of resources. And the Western financial system, and especially the United States financial system, is based on debt. The Federal Reserve issues debt. And the United States at this point is $36 trillion in debt, and it's in danger of insolvency. So in order to shore up its balance sheet, it needs more assets. And how do you do that? Well, you steal them. That's the way. That has been the modus operandi of the collective West for literally centuries. So the problem, of course, was that Russia is onto this, and they said, "Hell no, we're not going to do that." They thought that under Boris Yeltsin they could get away with it, but unfortunately for the West, Vladimir Putin, who was an obscure bureaucrat who was quite pro-Western. He wanted to be part of NATO. He thought there would be collective security, and the West continually rebuffed Vladimir Putin, and he rebuffed Russia's requests to be integrated in part of the West. The West says, no, we don't want that. What we want is regime change, and we want to get control of your resources. That is what it's all about. Now, there's a couple of other factors, and that is that Russia is an Orthodox Christian country, and one of the main bones to pick that the West has had is that it's Catholic and Roman Catholics who have always asserted the demand to have Catholic means universal. And basically, they're saying we're the voice of Christianity, and everybody else has to do it our way. So that was one aspect of it. And of course, the Russian Orthodox were not about to give up their sovereignty as a branch of Christianity. So that was a third reason why the West was against Russia. And the fourth reason is simply that the West, and this gets to like maybe the core of the issue, is that the West has a racist, racially superior attitude towards the rest of the world. If you look at the way they've treated country after country through Africa, South America, basically the West, they called it the white man's burden. We're gonna civilize you by stealing your resources because we are racially superior. We're superior morally, intellectually, in every way. We are superior to you, and so we are going to take over your countries, strip you of your resources, and enrich ourselves, and you are going to thank us for it. That has been the Western attitude. So here we are in 2025, and the United States and England and the EU and NATO have been working together to bring about the destruction of Ukraine. They're quite open about it. They said, we're going to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Heaven forbid we should risk lives of American or British armies to fight Russia, because we know that our population they won't put up with that. But secretly, they actually were doing that. There were troops from the United States and England and Poland and Germany and this has been coming out more and more recently, when Russia was bombing some of these military sites, and lo and behold, they're seeing people in uniforms with American flags on them, so this is what has been going on. So this is a secret war of the West against Russia, framing it as big bad Russia attacking innocent little Ukraine. And recently, Mark Rubio famously pointed out that this was a proxy war of the United States against Russia. So this is what is happening. The whole Ukraine scam, which was the story that you have been presented, is that Russia invaded poor little Ukraine unprovoked, when in fact it was the United States that overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine, built it up to be a dagger in the heart of Russia, to take Ukraine's resources, and then to bring down the Russian government and get control of Russia's massive resources. That is what the story is all about. Now, as I say, the problem is that the West completely underestimated Russia. This also happened in World War II. The Nazis, with their racial superiority, they thought that they could take down the Soviet Union. Hitler said it's a house of cards, and all we have to do is kick the door down, and the whole structure will collapse. That was basically the same, if I may say so, fascist attitude that the West has had towards the Russian Federation. They completely underestimated Russia, and frankly, I underestimated Russia. I think what happened was that as Boris Yeltsin was basically insulted and demeaned by Bill Clinton, and Vladimir Putin was listening in on those conversations. Gradually, Vladimir Putin realized, I think these guys really are not in our favor. He said to Bill Clinton, why don't we join NATO? Bill Clinton says, yeah, that's a great idea. Then he says, well, sorry, you can't do it. So gradually, Vladimir Putin came to the realization that the United States and Europe are really out to get Russia. Another major signpost of that was when the United States backed out. This is under George W. Bush, backed out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. What that treaty said was that the United States and Russia had massive missile capability, nuclear missile capability, and this doctrine was called the Mutually Assured Destruction Doctrine, MAD, which is aptly put. But George W. Bush said to Russia, we've decided we don't want to do this anymore, so we're going to install anti-ballistic missiles. So that means that we can attack you, and then if you try to counterattack, our missiles will shoot down your missiles, and we'll be able to win a nuclear war. That was the plan that was brought forth in 2002. And let's recall that also Ronald Reagan had this idea of Star Wars in the 1980s, which is essentially the same concept. So Russia started to realize, especially I would say, with this hostile attitude of NATO towards Russia, with this the anti-ballistic missile treaty, Russia, which had unilaterally disarmed, the Soviet Union had unilaterally disarmed when the Soviet Union broke up, which by the way many Russians consider to have been an illegal act, which was it was essentially an internal coup by comprador elites who wanted to get control of the resources of the Soviet Union for themselves. So there was internal corruption that brought down the Soviet Union. That's another story. But in any case, Russia realized that they were going to have to rebuild their military-industrial complex. And so probably starting in 2002, they started rebuilding their military. And then in 2007, there was a very important meeting called the Munich Security Conference, and Vladimir Putin gave a speech at that conference in which he said, we've got your number, we understand what you want to do, you want hegemony, you want to destroy our country, and frankly, we're not going to let you do that. And that was when Vladimir Putin really got put on the shit list of the West, and he's been on the shit list ever since. So that's 2007. 2008, there was a coup in the small country of Georgia, which used to be part of the Russian Empire. Joseph Stalin came from Georgia, in fact. The small country called Georgia, which was a constituent republic of the Soviet Union. And so they were armed to the teeth by the United States and the Israelis, and they thought that they could attack Russian peacekeepers in an area that had broken away from Georgia because it was being persecuted as being ethnic Russian instead of Georgian. And when the Georgian military, at the direction of the West, attacked Russian peacekeepers, the Russians' army, even though it was not that well equipped, but they basically in 5 days overran the Georgian military, and they put a stop to that. Russia could have gone straight into Tbilisi, which was the capital of Georgia, and basically ended Georgia as a vector for NATO. Georgia was supposed to become a member of NATO, and Russia essentially put a stop to that. So that was in 2008. Then we have 2014, the Ukraine coup. Again, Ukraine was supposed to become part of NATO. That was part of the plan. They talked about, the West talked about bringing Ukraine into NATO. Russia said, if you do that, you're going to have a war in your hands. Everybody in the West, they were given fair notice that it would be as if Russia staged a coup in, let's say, in Canada, and they weaponized extreme French-Canadian nationalists to take over the country and outlaw English as the dominant language. And they said, if you're English, you can't speak English, you have to speak French. And then they arm French Canada to the teeth, and then they start attacking English speakers in Canada with the intention eventually of invading the United States. This is essentially what was going on in Ukraine. You have two groups of different languages They're related. English and French are related, linguistically, just as Ukrainian and Russian are related linguistically. But it just didn't. Russia basically put its foot down and said, we're just not going to let you do that. So 2022 rolls around. They start actively, fighting back against this whole Western Ukraine project. And in 2025, it's basically game over. So, as I say, the Ukraine scam became exposed. It was obviously the whole idea of poor little Ukraine being attacked, unprovoked by Russia. That is the scam, and and now the United States realizes the game is up. They've spent tens or probably over at least last count I saw $175 billion, probably more than that, in Ukraine to bring down Russia, and it's failed. So now the U.S. and I would say the U.S. deep state essentially realize that the whole Biden plan is failing, and so they decide, let's get this guy Trump in, and let's take a different tack. So Trump becomes the president, and then he goes to Russia and he says, we really want peace, and those Biden people, they're really bad, and we're really sorry that this whole thing happened, and it's certainly, we had nothing to do with it, even though Trump had armed these Ukrainian Nazis, and even though Trump had backed out of two critical arms control treaties. He was clearly hostile to Russia in terms of his actions as president in his first term, but he's saying, "Oh, it's a terrible mistake. We had nothing to do with it." And they're supposed to, and they think that Russia's supposed to believe this after it's been lied to continually for 30 years since NATO promised not to expand. So that's where it is. So now Trump is he's realizing that this whole Ukraine project is not going to work. And now we have Zelensky. So Zelensky was elected in 2019, and he was, speaking of scams, he was a comedian, and you look at some of his quote unquote comedy routines, which look to me rather degenerate. I won't even go into the details of them, but you just see some of the videos and you think, this guy is presidential material, really? So he has given his own television show called Servant of the People, and Servant of the People, and he is going to he's a school teacher. Somehow he becomes elected president, and he starts rooting out corruption, and he turns out to be a really good guy, and he's going to get Ukraine back on track, because after the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine got taken over by its nationalistic elements, they were basically stripping Ukraine and wrecking Ukraine's economy. There was very, very little real development of Ukraine following the end of the Soviet Union. It was basically being privatized, and many Ukrainians left Ukraine because of poor working conditions and looking for better opportunities elsewhere. So Zelensky was supposed to come in there, and he said, this war that's been going on against the people in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, I'm going to put a stop to that. And he was elected with 75% of the vote in 2019. And then what happened was, I think there's a book that was written called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And he said that basically the strategy that the West employs is the silver bullet versus the lead bullet strategy, in which if you're the leader of a country, you are basically visited by some people from the West, and they're said, you can have a silver bullet or you can have a lead bullet. Which one do you want? The silver bullet, you're going to get rich. The lead bullet, you're going to be dead. And to emphasize that aspect, the Azov battalion and the neo-Nazi battalions basically said, you can say whatever you want about having peace with the Donbass. We're just not going to let you do that, because if you do, you're going to be hanging from a lamppost. So Zelensky very quickly changed his tune and became extremely Russophobic. So that was back in 2019. 2022, war breaks out. Again, Russia invaded Ukraine. It was not a shock and awe situation. They had only about a third of the army that Ukraine had, but it was strong enough to say to Zelensky, let's get down to business here. We're not going to let you continue this what you've been doing, and let's have peace talks, and let's finally implement real peace to give people in eastern Ukraine, some autonomy, so that their culture is protected. Well, Zelensky and his chief negotiators had agreed to all that. They had signed the documents, and then Boris Yeltsin came in from England, most likely at the direction of the United States, and said, "Don't you dare, follow through this treaty," because one of the main principles of it was denazification. And the West doesn't like denazification, because the Nazis they're like the shock troops of Western hegemony. So that was a major factor. And they said, we'll keep arming you, and people like Lindsey Graham and others were saying, we're going to fight those evil Russians to the last Ukrainian. So, and Zelensky went along with that, and he was able to, as president, able to enrich himself, by skimming kickbacks, you could say, out of all the money that was coming into Ukraine. So that was going on there. But of course, gradually Russia, when Russia realized that these negotiations are going nowhere, they basically realized, we're just going to have to deal with this situation, and I'll be getting to that in a little bit. So at a certain point, Zelensky, flashing forward to 2025, Trump understands that it's game over, that the United States is not going to win in Ukraine. The problem for Trump is that they put so much money into Ukraine that it's going to be really bad for the U.S. economy, because the U.S. economy depends on collateralizing all that debt, and they need to get control of the mineral resource and other resources of Ukraine in order to recollateralize the U.S. debt. So Trump says to Russia, let's have peace, because there's so many poor Ukrainians dying, and if you go all the way to Kiev, we're not going to get any of those assets that we promised to give to BlackRock. That is what is actually going on. When Trump expresses empathy, he's not being empathetic. He's being selfish. He wants to get as much control as he can of Ukraine's asset as possible, as a consolation prize for losing the war against Russia and getting control of Russia's resources. That's what they really wanted. That's failing. So as a consolation prize, they want to get Ukraine's resources. And Russia is basically saying, hell no. You guys effed around, and you're going to find out. So that is what is the state of situation is now. But the interesting thing here is that when the whole narrative regarding the relationship between Trump and Zelensky is quite interesting. Zelensky bought into this idea that he was going to be able to, profit from this war, and he didn't particularly care about how many Ukrainian men die on the front lines, as long as he was enriching himself. But I think at a certain point, it began to dawn on him that when people like Lindsey Graham said, we're going to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainians, it appears, I'm being a little speculative here, but it appears that Zelensky thought, now wait a second, you're asking us to fight, bleed, and die for BlackRock and for Trump's ego and for Wall Street, and for Monsanto and all these Western corporations that have bought up Ukrainian land and resources? That's what this really is all about? No, I don't think so. So even though Zelensky is a snake and completely unprincipled, he isn't completely crazy. And so when Trump said, here's this mineral deal, we've invested so much money in your country that you owe it to us to pay us back. And Zelensky is saying, we're paying you back in our blood. Blood is thicker than fiat currency, and we're not going to do it. So that is the dilemma that the United States is in now, because even Zelensky realizes what the scam is. So that's the issue. Now, moving on here, so we have Trump realizes it's the issue. We had Putin realizing that he was scammed. We have Zelensky realizing that he was scammed. And now the West is, particularly the Europeans, Trump is basically saying, we can't deal with this. We need to go on. We thought we were going to be able to take Russia down relatively easily. That's not working out. So we've got to move on to the main course is China. We have to take down China. And so you Europeans, we're dumping it on your lap. So you please, you keep Russia busy while we go on to Ukraine. So that's what's going on there. And meanwhile, Russia is constantly being attacked by Psy-war, by propaganda, Western propaganda. Most people have no idea what's been going on for the last 30 years, much less the last 10 years. So that brings me to this phrase called the dogs bark and the caravan moves on. And during the 1930s and 1940s, there was a phrase that Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union from roughly around 1925, after Lenin died, he basically became the leader of the Soviet Union and built up the Soviet Union, which had been decimated by World War I and by the sanctions against the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union, there was major problems with famine in the Soviet Union, and the country had been, whatever industry it had been deindustrialized. And Stalin basically said to the Soviet people, this is like in 1930, he said, we've got 10 years to do what the West did in 100 or 200 years. We need to industrialize ourselves and prepare ourselves for the coming war, because we know that the West wants to destroy us and get control of our resources and destroy us as a people. We understand that. And so Stalin basically during the 1930s, built up the Soviet Union. And there's a book actually, and there's a book, a couple of books. One of them is called The Great Conspiracy Against Russia, by a guy named Albert Kahn and Michael Sayer. And they talk about this fact that there was a conspiracy to take down the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1946 when the book was written. Another book that was written was called Mission to Moscow, and in that book the FDR had sent a friend from his university time named I forget his name at the moment, Joseph. I don't have it, but there's a movie, you can see it. It's on it's not on Odyssey. It's on Vimeo, called Mission to Moscow. And in Mission to Moscow, the movie starts off with an introduction by this guy, he was a Wall Street lawyer, hardly a socialist, Wall Street lawyer sent by FDR to find out what was going on with these purges in the Soviet Union. And what this Wall Street lawyer discovered was that the Soviet Union was being sabotaged from the inside by people who wanted to get control of it. And particularly Trotsky was willing to make deals with the Germans and the Japanese because he wanted to get control of the Soviet Union, and that was the reason why Stalin kicked him out. But in any case, and eventually he was killed because he was causing a lot of trouble. Not justifying it, but that's, you play dirty games, you get dirty results. In any case, the so the Soviet Union was able to defeat the Nazis in World War II, and in the beginning of World War II, the British and the United States really didn't think that the Soviet Union was going to be able to win World War II, but they were either pleasantly or unpleasantly surprised when the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis for the first time in a major battle. The Nazis had conquered Western Europe virtually without a fight. They prevented the takeover of Moscow by the Nazi army. And then in late 1942, the Nazis tried to take over Stalingrad. And again, not only did they not succeed in that, but it was the first really major defeat of the Nazi army. And it was not just Germany, but there were Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians, other countries that were involved in the Battle of Stalingrad. Something like 2 million people on both sides died in that battle. But it was at that turning point that the West realized that the Soviet Union was almost certainly going to win. And later in that year, there was a battle called Kursk, which is an area of the Soviet Union. And there was a huge tank battle, probably the biggest tank battle in history. And the Soviet Union again knocked the crap out of the German army, and the German army had to kind of withdraw in defeat. So, and this is very poignant for Russia now because Ukraine attacked the Kursk region again, last year, thinking that they were going to give Russia a real black eye, and of course, Russia defeated them a second time. This is significant because there were German generals at the start of that operation who were saying, "Oh boy, those Ruskies beat us the last time, but we're going to get them this time," and they failed again. The Europeans, they just don't learn. They have this innate hatred for Russia. They just can't. It's like in their DNA. There's some kind of psychological aberration in their brains where they keep attacking Russia, and Russia keeps kicking the crap out of them. They just don't learn. So that brings us to the final part here, which is, I'm calling this the happy sad ending. So the United States and Europe are all saying, if Russia wins this war, it's going to be a disaster for Ukraine. And I'm saying it depends on your point of view, because when Ukraine has been part of the Russian cultural space for generations and centuries. When I was a child, my grandmother, who came from Lithuania, part of the Russian Empire at that time, we're talking about 1900, she said to me, there's an expression called "you can ask your way to Kiev." And what that means is that Kiev is a major cultural center of the Russian cultural space. And the United States tried to rip Kiev and rip Ukraine out of Russia. It was as if they were basically cutting the heart out, or cutting a major organ out of the body politic of Russia. And they thought that by removing Ukraine, they could fatally wound Russia. Well, the issue is, will Ukraine be better off or worse off if Russia takes it under its control again? And we can see from 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union what has been the trajectory of Ukraine as a country separate from the Soviet Union. The fact of the matter is, as I've written in other articles, in I think 1945 or 1948, the population of Ukraine post-World War II was about 35 million people. By the time of the end of the Soviet Union, the population was something like 53 million people. It was a 50% increase in population. It had major shipbuilding, it had major aircraft industry, it had filmmaking industry, it had great agricultural resources. And so when the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, it was built up to a significant extent. The dams, the infrastructure, the electrical grid, these are all built by the Soviet Union. And the cities are Russian cities with quite beautiful architecture. I have a friend in one city. I won't mention the name of it to protect that person's identity, but they're saying that I met this person in Chiang Mai, and they're back in their home city to take care of their mother, and and they said, in the Soviet Union time when she was growing up, this was a beautiful Soviet city. Since the Soviet Union fell, almost no infrastructure has been built, and it's basically been asset stripped. One of the cities that was taken over by these neo-Nazis following the coup was Mariupol. And in 2022, Mariupol, there was a big battle for Mariupol. There was something called the Azovstal, the Azov Steelworks. Azov being the name of the sea, which is part of it's like an area of an offshoot of the Black Sea. And so Azov is the name of this small sea, and of course the Azov Battalion is a neo-Nazi formation that they named themselves after Azov. They were in control of the Azov steel complex, and it took the Russians a significant amount of time, several months, to finally clean them out. But Mariupol had been decimated during that battle. People were living in basements. They're starving. It was, the Azov Battalion was shooting. If you just went out to try and get some water or some food, they'd shoot you. And many of the buildings were ruined. And but eventually the Russians got control of Mariupol. And guess what? They brought in massive construction crews, and they've rebuilt many of the apartment buildings and rebuilt whole neighborhoods, and people are being given free apartments. So when people think that Ukraine is going to be worse off when the Russians come in, I beg to differ. I think that when Ukraine is brought back under under Mother Russia, which it had been part of Ukraine was part of the Russian family for centuries, going back 1,000 years. When Ukraine is taken back under the wing of Russia, it will be rebuilt and come back eventually to achieve some degree of healing. As another indication of that, after the Soviet Union fell, the West was determined to continue to destroy Russia and the Russian Federation, and they went after a province of an oblast that is a region of the Russian Federation called Chechnya. And Chechnya was predominantly is a Muslim area, and interestingly, Islam within Russia has been a major. It's one of the four major religions within Russia. There's Russian Orthodox, which is predominant, and Islam, which is secondary. Judaism and Buddhism are the four major religions the four recognized religions within Russia. And so there was this terrible war where the United States basically weaponized these Islamic extremists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, all those people that have caused lots of problems, all of whom have been weaponized by the United States in Syria, in Afghanistan, and so on. The Russians eventually defeated them, and the capital of Chechnya was Grozny, and Grozny has been rebuilt. And amazingly enough, who were some of the greatest advocates for Russia? It's these Muslim soldiers who understood that they understood what was at stake, and they realized that their fortunes are far better off being with the Russian Federation than being part of the West, which destroys every country it touches sooner or later. That's what is the reality of this whole situation. So that's why I say that Russia is going to win this war. They they had many false starts. They believed the promises of the United States and the EU and NATO. They were all lies, and so Russia is saying, the dogs bark and the caravan moves on. We're the Russian Federation. We have to take care of our people. We cannot tolerate these continuous attacks against our country, and we're just not going to listen to these people anymore. So when Trump comes in and he says, "Oh, let's negotiate," Putin will say, "Yeah, let's do that." But he knows that the game is up. Trump probably knows that the game is up, and he's in a bad place because he thought that he could fool the Russians into another false ceasefire, and the Russians are just not going to play along. So that's the situation. Now, I just want to finish off by saying that I have a couple of websites that you can go to. One is Gear Bubble, one is Amazon, where you can buy T-shirts. And I don't make tons of money off of those T-shirts, but my main goal here is that we are in a terrible situation in the world right now, and people will maybe accuse me of being pro-Russian. It's not that I'm pro-Russian. I'm pro-American. And what I've been watching in my country for the last 20 plus years, I read a book in 1999 called The Unauthorized Biography of George Bush, the father of George W. Bush. And you look at who this guy was, who his father was, and you realize that you've got an element within the United States society. These are people who have massive wealth and massive power, and they're determined to, as George Carlin says, they want more for themselves and less for everybody else. And they've been using the American people. They've been stupefying the American people with propaganda for at least 50 since World War II. As Bill Casey, who was the CIA director under Ronald Reagan, said, "We'll know our propaganda program is successful when everything the American people know is false." So the purpose of my channel is to present historical truth, to wake people up to realize this is how we got to this place. What are we going to do about it? And the way we start is by becoming aware of how we got here. And that is the reason for my videos, what I'm trying to do, and what I hope I've conveyed to you in this video. So thank you very much for listening. Please share this video with other people. Talk about it with people. Make them aware of what is going on. And that way, I hope that we can turn the situation in the West. We've got to get the West to become civilized. They call themselves Western civilization when they've been going around the planet for 500 years destroying countries. That's hardly civilized. And we look at the way the United States treats its own people. The healthcare costs, the food's no good. It's filled with poisons. The whole society is basically crumbling because all the money goes into either sucking up to the wealthy people, or being thrown away on these very destructive wars. So we have to turn this situation around. We need a complete cultural revivification. We need a revival of the American dream as it was meant to be in the Russian Revolution. And that revolution was basically commandeered by the slave owners and by the wealthy who wrote the Constitution in their favor. We have to rewrite the Constitution, and we got to start by stopping these wars. So that's what I have to say. I really appreciate your listening in to my rant here, and I'll see you next time.